Hello everybody, I'm Rene Ramos, director of the Lynn and Louis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives, and this is Rewind, the show that looks back on Florida's past with historic film and video. It's time for another trip back into the past, so sit back, relax, and enjoy another episode of Rewind.
Do the Russians really have agents quietly living as normal Americans, just waiting for a chance to overthrow the government? Some surprising information on Soviet spies from this expert. And what's the greatest threat to your life? Possibly the person who thinks he can drive safely after belting down a few. This is Montage. Hello, I'm Joe Averill. Tonight we have an unusual and very compelling guest who has some remarkable stories about spies and international terrorism right after these messages.
Miami-Dade College has career paths in anything you want to be. What's your story? Be global. Be cutting edge. Be inventive. Be investigative. Be a hero. What do you want to be? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
Robert Moss is a British journalist who specializes in keeping us up to date on the activities of terrorists and spies. He's one of the foremost experts in the West on the KGB, the Soviet secret police and intelligence organization. Last year he made a sensation with his best-selling novel, The Spike, in which he told about Soviet disinformation activities, the deliberate spreading of lies in the Western press to cause disruption here. He's got a new novel now called Death Beam about killer satellites. His novels are fiction, of course, but they have a certain ring of truth about them. And when he was here recently, I started by asking him if we really could believe that his tales of spies and espionage reflect happenings in the real world.
You know, I write about spies and intelligence and intrigue, as you say. And I couldn't do this with any claim to authenticity had I not rubbed shoulders with a lot of people from secret services around the world. I made a special interest out of interviewing defectors from Soviet intelligence who've been able to tell me firsthand how things are planned and executed at Moscow Center. This is the background out of which I write a book like Death Beam. Now, a work of fiction like Death Beam is, of course, as you say, in a sense, unquestionable. It's an entertainment. People can read it at that level. But it does tell stories that are very close to the truth.
Which I presume is one of your missions, to tell a story that does have a great deal of potential truth in them in an entertaining way, but hopefully I would presume you want to deliver a message to people that reality is just around the corner, don't you?
Reality is sometimes pretty scary, you know, Joe. There's a story early on in Death Beam of a Soviet military exercise in which the Soviet special forces, which are called the Spetsnaz units, they're Green Berets. Spetsnaz is an acronym which means Special Designation Troops. They are rehearsing a scenario for assassinating political and military leaders in the West. And in this exercise, they link up with terrorist cells in a Western country. And they torture each other in the course of the exercise with great brutality. Now, some readers have said to me, this isn't possible. This is a fiction writer's imagination. That was based on the first-hand account of a recent defector from Russian military intelligence. That service is called the GRU, who has told me in great detail about Soviet involvement in world terrorism, including practice, dry runs, rehearsals for executive agent operations in which the Soviets would assassinate leaders in the West.
Really brings us to the, and good heavens, we're taping this now. Something terrible may have come to pass by the time this gets to the air, but as we speak this evening, there are indications that Gaddafi has sent an assassination team into this country to kill President Reagan and many others. I presume you think that's quite possible that is happening.
Perfectly plausible. Gaddafi has a great enthusiasm for terrorist operations. He supports terrorists all over the world. He's been implicated in a number of assassination plots against world leaders in the past. He was involved in at least 3 assassination attempts on the life of President Sadat in Egypt before Sadat was actually struck down. And so the man is capable of it, yes.
We go back to your book, The Spike, in which I think the central theme was Soviet disinformation. In other words, distracting our attention from what's really occurring by a lot of poo-pooing, a lot of people saying, well, that's so ridiculous. And then I recall that about the time your book was on the bestseller list, that 60 Minutes had on George Kennan, essentially saying, oh, please, let's don't overreact to the Soviets. All of this cloak and dagger stuff is really just overreacting. Did you see that interview, and what did you think at the time when you saw that?
Well, it's wishful thinking. It's very strange how George Kennan has evolved, because once he seemed to understand these things fairly well, he's recanted his early rather hard line on the Soviets. You know, we can have this rhetoric going back and forth, and we get involved in a welter of facts about what the Russians are or are not doing. Sometimes a single image tells us a lot more than all the verbiage. I remember looking at some aerial reconnaissance photographs a few years ago, which showed underground food silos that the Russians are building outside major cities like Kiev and Kharkov. Now picture this, Joe. Underground food silos 3 times the size of a football field, in which, under reinforced surfaces as hard as they use to protect their missiles, the Russians are burying food, including wheat imported from the United States. Now what does that tell us about the Soviet mentality, the mentality of their leadership? This is a country that can't even grow enough food to feed its own population. Why do they bury imported grain in the ground? I think that reflects the mentality of a leadership which is set out to build the biggest war machine the world has seen and wants to have the capacity to fight and survive an all-out war. I think we have to deal with information of this kind.
Is the Soviet Union behind most, 90%, a large majority of all the terrorist attacks and threats that are present in the world today?
The Soviets are exploiting international terrorism, and they provide the infrastructure for terrorism. They provide training, arms, financing, operational intelligence, rest and recreation, medical treatment. Leila Khalid, the notorious hijacker who was arrested in London in 1970, was in East Berlin, part of the Soviet bloc, last year to receive medical treatment for what I believe is known in polite circles as a social disease. The Russians are providing this kind of support base. Now, they use subcontractors or intermediaries. They don't want to be directly nailed with responsibility for operations in Western countries. That would interfere with political and diplomatic games that they're playing. So they work through these subcontractors or surrogates. The PLO is very important to them in this respect. They're training about 2,000 Palestinians in the Soviet Union right now. Guerrilla training courses, military courses, intelligence courses. They work via radical Arab governments, including the Libyan regime. They work via Castro in Cuba. And I think that basically they have a generalized interest in disrupting our lives in the West as much as possible, and that extends to supporting terrorism.
Do you have any information that the Mariolito influx of refugees, which has disrupted terribly this small portion of the United States, it hasn't generally affected the country at large, but do you have any information, or do you believe that that was a conscious effort by Castro to infiltrate a large number of agents here to disrupt South Florida, or was it a rather extraordinary occurrence that got out of his control and hands?
I think it was a controlled process on Castro's side. I think that Castro understands that he can cause considerable social disruption in the United States, and I think he used the boat lift in that way. I think he did use it to infiltrate agents, espionage agents, and potential terrorist saboteurs. Let's remember that this country has a problem with undocumented immigrants. There are large numbers of them. They provide an almost unique sanctuary for potential troublemakers in the United States. Now, how far Castro might go in this same way under the Reagan administration, or rather against the Reagan administration, is a matter of, I think, some urgent concern to us. There are intelligence reports that in a secret meeting held in Nicaragua last year, a little town called Monimbo, where Castro addressed a group of Central American revolutionaries, he boasted that his agents in the United States are so widespread that he can unleash a race war at a moment of his choosing. Now, what is this? Is this hollow Cuban boasting? I believe this report, by the way. I have more details on it. Is this hollow Cuban boasting, or does it reflect something that Castro might attempt as a reprisal against Reagan policies in Central America? I think we should be concerned about the potential for disruption there.
Well, you know, some of the defectors we have, or some of the double agents we have turned in this country, have reported that there are still hundreds of Soviet agents who have infiltrated this country and are, I forgot the word, moles, I guess you would say, but not really moles, that more applies to organizations, but who have assumed identities and roles in American life across this country, waiting for that day, 20 years from now perhaps, when there's another Pearl Harbor and they arise and take over. Do you believe that?
I believe there are sleeper networks.
Sleepers, right.
People who will be held in reserve under fake identities for many years before they are actually mobilized. I believe that these sleeper networks, controlled by the Soviets and by other governments, by the Cubans, by the Libyans to some extent, include potential saboteurs and terrorists who could be mobilized in times of international confrontation to sabotage vital communications and installations in this country.
Robert, let me try a scenario on you, Robert, which I think is one of the problems or one of the positive sides of American life, and being an American, I think I can represent it. And that is the following. Yes, the Russians probably do have agents, but once any Russian or any non-American lives in this country for a number of years and learns what freedom is all about, they will suddenly turn and find out it's a wonderful place and that it's better than any life they gave up, and that they want to keep that life and will eventually be turned to the American way. Now, I'm oversimplifying it and being naive, but I think most Americans still truly believe that.
Well, I think that there's some truth in what you say. I think that it's a great problem for the Russians and for any totalitarian dictatorship around the world that the freedoms and the quality of life available in the West will be enormously attractive to their own people, including their own espionage operatives, who are always likely to want to defect or to do a deal with the West if they can get away with it. How do they deal with this problem from their position? They deal with it by holding out the threat of brutal reprisals for disloyalty. Russian defectors are sentenced to death in secret hearings in the Soviet Union, and although the death sentences are not being executed in recent years, a sword hangs over the head of those who defect to the West, and I think they use such threats to a considerable extent.
There is a current theory, it's not current now, it's about 2 years old, but I think it is still current in intelligence circles, that there is a mole, very high mole in the CIA. Do you believe that's true?
I don't believe that the CIA has been victimized by a mole of the importance of, say, Kim Philby in the British Secret Service, or Heinz Filfer, who once ran the counterintelligence section of the West German Secret Service on behalf of the Russians. I tell the story in Death Beam, in the new book, of a double agent, a Soviet double agent, who in the book is given the fictional alcoholic code name of Martini, who is a Russian in the KGB, reporting to the CIA and trusted by the CIA as a precious source on the secrets of Moscow Center, but all along is feeding in deception or disinformation into the US government on behalf of the KGB. Now, I believe that the CIA was conned in real life in precisely this way. Since Death Beam was published, in fact, the Washington Post has carried a report that after intensive investigations last year, the FBI concluded that a real-life Russian double agent reporting to American intelligence had been working for the KGB all the years that he was trusted. One of his code names was Fedora, another was the alcoholic code name of Scotch. In other words, I'm saying I think the CIA has been conned. I think it got some of its estimates of Soviet intentions and military capabilities wrong because it was conned. I think the CIA has been penetrated at relatively low levels by the KGB, and that has cost the United States some very valuable blueprints and scientific secrets. But I don't believe there's a Philby figure high up in the CIA.
But yet we're seeing that some clerks and some relatively low-level people have delivered some incredibly sensitive documents. The satellite maintenance manual delivered by the warrant officer to the Russians.
That's right.
Disrupted years of work of this country.
That's right.
Now, there was a guy who had access to...
That's right.
First of all, I was shocked to find out he had such easy access. What does that tell us about the way we protect things in this country, this open society?
Well, we've been pretty free and easy, and let's remember that the Russians can read a lot of what they want to know in the open literature.
Right.
The Ministry of Foreign Trade in Russia subscribes to everything that is published in the United States. Every single publication of any kind is run through their computers and analyzed for what is available in the public sector. As you say, some very low-level people have sold some very big stuff for very low money sometimes.
Yeah.
The secrets of the KH-11 spy satellite, a multi-million-dollar project of this country, were sold to the Russians for $3,000, which isn't a lot of money for which to barter your soul. So that's going on. But, you know, a lot of people, when they think about the spy world, tend to feel that the most damage that a double agent can do is to sell out secrets of that kind. It's possible that there's something even more dangerous and damaging that he can do, and that is to so deceive and mislead the government of the target country about his own master's intentions, that they do the wrong things, ignore the real dangers, and react to illusory ones.
Well, what are the real dangers we face today from your very sophisticated, realistic viewpoint for this country?
Well, I think the number one problem, which overshadows all of our lives, is the growth of the Soviet war machine. Now, this includes Soviet inroads into the wilder frontiers of military technology. The Russians have had a space weapons program for the last 25 years, which has enabled them to develop a killer satellite armed with a laser weapon which is capable of blinding US satellites, at least in low orbit. Now, not in the year 2001. We're not talking Buck Rogers or Darth Vader.
Right.
We're talking about real weapon systems. I believe, in fact, that the next war, if there is one, is going to be won or lost in space. and that the United States can't afford to lose a race to deploy space weaponry.
Major General George Keegan, I think, resigned and has become, in many people's minds, a kook, because he has been essentially saying many of the same things you're saying about the space.
Well, you know, George Keegan had a great vice, Joe. He was prematurely accurate.
Right.
Now, there's such a thing as being right too soon. You know, communists in the days of the Nazi-Soviet pact used to talk about being prematurely anti-fascist. You know, you could be anti-fascist too early on.
Exactly.
We've had the same problem in recent years. George Keegan was described wrongly by some people as a kook or a wild man because he pointed to a real problem, which it's now understood in Washington as something we should all be concerned about.
How damaging was Jimmy Carter's house cleaning at the CIA?
I think that it was probably less damaging than some things that had gone on before. He didn't help to put things back together. But I think that the worst and the real damage done at the CIA probably predated the Carter administration. There was a purge going on earlier than that. And of course, there was an inquiry, a public debate going on in this country, which was healthy in many respects, but which did shackle the U.S. intelligence community in unnecessary ways, I believe. And it did drive a lot of good veterans of the CIA into premature retirement because they felt they were being turned into 9-to-5 paper-pushing bureaucrats, which is not why they took on the job in the first place.
Robert, we could talk all night. One last question. We're just out of time. How important is Cuba to the Soviets' overall strategy against the West?
Cuba plays an absolutely critical role in Soviet designs, and of course Castro is not a free agent in any respect. He relies on the Russians completely. He receives $8 million a day in subsidies from the Soviet bloc. That's one index of his dependence. The Cubans are important as auxiliaries, as mercenaries, available for operations all across the world, in Africa, the Middle East, Central America, wherever. They're particularly important for the Soviets and their designs vis-a-vis the United States, because for one thing, Cubans are more acceptable, ironically, to many Americans. Castro-Cubans are more acceptable than Russians. Many people who would not work with the Russians feel that somehow it's romantic to work with Fidel Castro. So in trying to recruit Americans for their operations, the Russians often work via Castro-Cubans.
We see so much illicit drug traffic here. It's disrupting this community terribly. Is that a Soviet-inspired phenomenon?
Well, I don't think you could blame the drug traffic simply on the Soviets. I think that the Cubans are exploiting this traffic. I think that Castro has a hand in it. I know of shipments that go via Havana. I know of trade-offs of guerrillas supported by Cuba and Colombia and other places supplying drugs in return for arms. I know of drug money being used to finance Castro agents in the Western Hemisphere. So they're exploiting it. But that situation is a much broader one.
Let's presume Ronald Reagan said, we've had enough, we're going to invade Cuba and stop this Soviet presence in our midst. What would the Russians do?
Well, it's an interesting question. Would the Russians risk everything for the sake of Cuba? I think that's something that must give Fidel Castro some sleepless nights. We don't know the answer. There is, of course, a Soviet combat brigade in Cuba. There are Soviet pilots on Soviet planes patrolling the skies. Would the Russians stand back or not? I don't know the answer. I think it would probably depend on whether they could do a trade-off. I think if it came to the crunch and they felt that they could trade Cuba, give up Cuba in a sense, in return for something somewhere else, in Europe or in Iran, they might be prepared to sacrifice Castro.
Indeed. Well, Robert Moss, your newest book is called The Death Beam. I hope it's more fiction than fact, but I fear it is not. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Joe.
We'll be right back.
Miami-Dade College has career paths in anything you want to be. What's your story? Be global. Be cutting edge. Be inventive. Be investigative. Be a hero. What do you want to be? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
Last year, Florida motorists broke a record that no one could possibly be proud of. For the first time, over 3,000 persons were killed in traffic accidents in this state, with drunk and drugged drivers involved in over half these fatalities. Also, for the first time in many years, it appears that new driving laws will finally be passed in Tallahassee, with tougher penalties for anyone caught driving under the influence. Substance abuse, too much alcohol, too many drugs, has reached a staggering proportion in Florida. The seriousness of the problem, whom it affects, and what's being done to better protect all of us will be examined in a special two-part report, Death on the Highway, next week on Montage. Here's Nancy Ross with a preview.
No, boom, right? I'll put this one right now, right? Straight. Hit my nose.
You have not,
boom.
you're not paying attention. Let me show you something else.
You gotta tilt my head.
In Florida's traffic courts, one picture is worth 1,000 words, and maybe even a DUI conviction. This is the Broward County Breath Alcohol Testing Unit, the Batmobile, and it's the job of this police team to videotape test results of persons arrested for DUI, driving under the influence. The tapes are seen by a judge and jury if the case goes to court, and it's the newest step in helping to convict and punish a dangerous criminal. The problem with these arrests is that the offender is usually unsuspecting. It could be your husband or wife, your neighbor, your doctor, your lawyer. It could even be your child. All it takes is one drink too many, maybe mixed with a Quaalude, to turn a motor vehicle into a weapon and turn its driver into a killer. All it takes is this one selfish mistake to change a life, to break up a family, to end other lives before their time.
In the legal sense, yes, you got the max, but that doesn't solve our problem, or in any way.
There isn't enough justice in the world
Right.
for what he took away.
Nothing will replace the kids.
My life will never be the same. You know, my children were my whole life, and 2/3 of that life has been taken away from me. As far as my own feelings, no. Justice will never be served for what he did to my children.
Of every 2,000 impaired drivers on the highway, only one gets caught, and many Floridians have decided it's time to get tougher. They're working to create new laws to protect us from those drivers with a license to maim and kill before we meet them on the road.
It's too late. By the time they've gotten cirrhosis, by the time they've gotten all of the other medical problems associated with their alcoholism, by the time they've shot their wife, by the time they've gotten a divorce, by the time they've committed suicide, by the time they have fallen off of the bridge, all of those sorts of things that people who have substance abuse problems do to themselves and to their loved ones and to their families and to their friends and to their jobs and to their employers. It's too late.
Miami-Dade College has career paths in anything you want to be. What's your story? Be global. Be cutting edge. Be inventive. Be investigative. Be a hero. What do you want to be? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
With the new tax law that went into effect late last year, a lot of people are taking advantage of an opportunity they didn't have before. The chance to open up an individual retirement account, also known as IRA. These accounts let you set aside some of your current income without paying taxes on it. The money goes into a tax-deferred account for your retirement. But there is a bewildering range of choices to make in deciding where and how to invest the money in your IRA account, and there are lots of financial institutions eager to hold your money for you. Here's one source of information on IRAs that's available for free. You can get this booklet by writing to the Investment Company Institute at 1775 K Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20006. Again, that's the Investment Company Institute, 1775 K Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20006. The booklet has an explanation of what IRAs are all about and how they might work for you. Now beware that the second half of the booklet suggests that you consider one particular way of investing your money, mutual funds, but there are many other ways and other choices. Next week on Montage, in addition to our special report, Death on the Highway, I'll have a visit from ocean explorer Jean-Michel Cousteau. He's the eldest son of Jacques Cousteau and a distinguished scientist in his own right. Currently, he's embarked upon the campaign to save many species of whales from extinction. That's our montage for this week. I'm Joe Averill.
That's about it for this edition of Rewind. just time to remind you that Rewind features historical film and video from the Lynn and Lewis Wolfson II Florida Moving Image Archives. To see more from the Wolfson Archives collections, visit our website, wolfsonarchives.org. You can search the archives catalog and watch video online. And be sure to connect to our YouTube channel, where you will find hundreds of carefully curated clips, or link to the Wolfson Archives Facebook page to keep up with our busy calendar of historical happenings. Until next time, I'm Rene Ramos. Thanks for watching.